building. It's a Ramsey FM30B. So it's an FM transmitter that you can use to transmit your music throughout your house or the neighborhood if you wanted to. It can go up to, I think, 3 miles if you were to turn the power up on it. The nice thing about this one is it has a digital display, and all the controls are external. You don't have to actually crack it open to change frequencies and that kind of stuff. And this is the first time I've seen this kit, so it'll be an experience trying to figure out all the components and getting them onto the board properly. And oh boy. So that's not exactly the way I would want to receive a kit. I would kind of want all the components to be in their separate bags. This way we'll have to fish through that bag to figure out what's what. But I guess that's part of DIY, right? Is you have to fish through it to figure it out. And other kits that I've received have been a lot better separated out and a lot better marked. Like this one is just a bunch of resistors in a bag, so we're going to have to figure out which ones are which. Same thing with this, it's a bunch of, I'm not sure, in the bag. I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer, so I'm going to have to rely on the instructions to get this done. Yeah, well, it'll be fun putting this together. That's all I can say. I like this stuff. So, and old man has to put glasses on. So what we've done here is we've taken everything out of the bag, out of the little Ziploc bags that they were all kind of mixed in together. We've got a group of resistors here. We've got a group of whatever's here. I think they're capacitors. And then here's the brains and everything of the whole unit. So then we got a bunch of diodes and little sockets and a little pot. So basically what we need to do now is we need to go through all these parts, compare it to the parts list, and figure out what we got. But hopefully it's all here and we'll be able to get this thing together today and see how it works. So, okay. Alright, so what we've done so far, an hour and 30 minutes, no, what was it, an hour and 45 minutes or whatever, we went through the parts list. All these different parts here, checked them all off to make sure we've got everything. Unfortunately, we have two issues. One, we have a 18 picofarad ceramic disc that says it's supposed to be marked 18 and is actually marked 18K. And then we have a 100 picofarad ceramic capacitor. We're supposed to have 5 and we only have 4, so we're missing a part. What we've done here is we've marked everything right there on the bottom. All the different parts we've marked with the value, and in some cases with the marking number, so that later when we go through this, I'll show you another one here real quick. So we put the marking that's on the component here, 104, and then the value of the component here, because none of these are all marked. You have to read the little tiny numbers on top of them on the component itself. So we've used our loop and our little magnifying glass here with a light on it to read everything. But you can see what we've done is we've segregated everything out into dishes, so we can keep resistors and capacitors, and this is a through-hole capacitors, or different type of capacitors, and then the power button switches and all that stuff is in here. And the ones that were singles, we went ahead and put a piece of tape on there. This is, what is this called? Smart tape, magic tape, whatever?
Magic tape.
Magic
yes.
tape, you can write right on it. So that way when we're getting to it, we can just go, oh, I need a 20K. Well, there she is. And then you just pull the tape off. The only issue we might have with this tape, and we'll see later, as if it leaves a residue on the leg. But that part of the leg we're going to cut off anyway, but I don't think it's going to be an issue. This is for the front panel, and there's components here listed, and then here's where the main board starts, but there's some components on the main panel that are also on the front panel. So when you're looking for your quantities, make sure that you're looking at, you check both lists until you're done with all the ones on the front panel, because we were looking for one resistor and there's actually 5 of them, and logically you would think, okay, we're looking for one individual one, but actually it was a pack of 5 that we're supposed to be looking for. So that kind of helps you figure out what you're looking for. You just find out how many of that different one there are, and usually they have them on the strips that's the right quantity. And this actually has a section here that's for surface mount components. So we went through and looked at the board itself and checked all the surface mount components. They're all there, so that's good to go. So the next thing we did, I actually downloaded the PDF. This is a really good tip. You download the PDF, put it on a computer or on like this, my tablet. It's not an iPad, by the way. He's a Mac, I'm a PC. So anyway, this is an Android actually, but so now what I can do is I can go through and look at the whole instruction book, and the really cool part about it is if they've got the PC board in there, and then I can zoom in on the different sections of the board if I really wanted to see what's going on there. We've got our soldering iron set to 700 degrees. We've got a rubber pad here, and you keep it nice and moist. A bottle of water, and for later I've got a bottle of alcohol. And with the yeah, not that kind of alcohol, but this is isopropyl alcohol, 70%. What this is for is when you're soldering, you're using some flux or some solder that has a flux core basically, or a rosin core, and when you're soldering it's going to splatter, and you don't want to do this very often, but eventually you're going to want to clean that off, I think, to clean up the board, make it look a little nicer, and also just to get the flux off of the other pads you're going to be working with. So we use this and some pads that I've got, and then I've also got tweezers. These are very sharp tweezers in case I wanted to rearrange his surface mount stuff, or in case there's a component that's hard to pick up or whatever. And then a good set of cutters, set of third hands basically. You can clip the board to it and it'll hold it in place while you're trying to do some of the soldering. Another essential piece is solder wick. So if you're desoldering, you can actually pull the solder up off the component if you want to take it back off. I also have a bulb here. It's a solder sucker basically. This one works decently, it's okay, but the plunger ones that have the spring in it are probably a little better. And then I've also got a desoldering iron in case I need to really get after it. But good flashlight, so you can actually really get some good light on what you're looking at. This is an LED 80 lumen flashlight that does a pretty good job. A variety of different magnifiers. I've got a lighted magnifier. It's like for reading books and stuff, or for looking at a board, and you can get light right on your subject. This is for cleaning the tip of your soldering iron. So for the soldering iron, I've got just the normal tip on it. There's different tips you can get, which there's a chisel tip and just this normal tip and a sharp tip. I mean, there's all kinds of different tips. Depends on what you're soldering. But the key to the soldering is to make sure that you tin your tip. So I've tinned it already, but you take your solder, you clean the tip off, right? And this is a cleaner too. You put it in there and spin it, and it cleans the end of the solder off, or end of the tip off, the soldering iron off. And what you do is tinning it is just putting solder on it to get it. You see the smoke coming out. That's the rosin core, the flux burning off, and that's tinning the tip. And basically, what you're trying to do is cover the tip with solder so that it doesn't oxidize. And before you start soldering, you clean that off, put a little dab of solder on it, and then start your soldering. You want to have clean solder when you're soldering to get good connections. And whenever you take a breaker, you put the soldering iron down, you clean it off, tin it again, and then put it in its holder. And that's the way it should be stored, because then it'll keep the tip from corroding or getting oxidation on it. And that's how you get a really clean, shiny solder and a really good solder joint. And some of these components is pretty critical. The other part that we've done is we've got a grounding strap and a grounding pad. This pad underneath here is an ESD pad. Some of the components that we'll be working with are sensitive to ESD. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reviews said that there is a component that could burn out even when you're just moving the unit around. And so you put the components in through this side, hold them in place, and then bend over the legs on the back side, and then all these little pads, that's what you're going to be soldering it to on the back side. So with that, I think we're ready to start following the instructions after a little break. Okay, so first thing that we are instructed to do is to separate the main board from the display board, which is this piece right here. So basically all they want us to do is take this board off of this board, and the way to do that is you just grasp the board and snap her off. And then the last thing that you need to do right here is these little tabs, and then on the main board the same thing, little tabs here, and they tell us to take some sandpaper and take those tabs off. So all you do is you basically take a file or sandpaper. I would use just some sandpaper and just sand them right off until they're smooth. The result of that sanding and we use little files to get it off of there, and now you got debris on the board. So what I do is I take my alcohol and soak the pad with alcohol. And you want to be careful with this little pad here. You don't want to booger that up when you're sanding the stuff off, and you also don't want to get alcohol on it, I don't think, but you just kind of wipe the board down to get the dust off of it, because you're going to have to be soldering on this. You don't want it to have that residue on it. So I just wipe down the whole board, get it nice and clean. That's basically all you have to do, just get it nice and clean. Okay, so the first thing we put in is this U5 quad rail op amp. When you're putting it in, on the board there's a notch here. You see this little notch on this one over here? That marks that the end of the chip that has pin 1 on it. And then also on the pads themselves, pad 1 or pin 1 has a square pad versus a rounded pad. On the chip itself, there's a little dot that marks pin 1, and then there's a little notch on the end of the chip. And you need to make sure that that's in the right orientation when you put it in. So put it in there, make sure all the pins are flat, and you flip the board over. What I've done is I've taken the first one corner pin and bent it just a little bit, and another corner pin and bent it just a little bit, and that will hold the pin, the chip in place for me. You could use a piece of tape on the back side to hold it in place if you wanted to, but I don't usually like using tape because of the residue and getting the tape back off. And then the other thing is, when you lay it flat on the table, and this is one of the reasons we do ICs first, is you lay it on the table and then the IC is held in place by the tape, by it being laying on the table. So I'm going to go ahead and solder the first couple pins, or the first corner pins anyway, those ones that I bent over. So basically I clean off my soldering iron, get it nice and clean, get everything off of it, and then tin it just a little bit, just to make sure I've got nice clean soldering iron, right? And then put a little dab of solder on it, go to the first pin, and what you're doing when you're soldering is you're heating the pad and then putting solder on the pad that'll be drawn to the soldering iron. So you put it on the pad and then you draw to the soldering iron, get it started, put enough solder on it, and then lift. That's all you do. And you go to the second one, put on the pad, draw to it, put enough in there and lift. I didn't have enough on that one. So, and when you set it down, before I go any further, I'm going to check on the other side of the board. And if you've got enough solder on it, you should see the solder coming through to the other side of the board too. It'll solder, actually, what it does is it wicks right through the board up the pin, because you're touching the pin when you're doing this. Wicks right up the pin and actually solders on the top side of the board too, so you get a good coverage, good connection for that joint. And now that chip's held in place. Now we can go ahead and solder the rest of the pins. We go. So now you can see all the pins are soldered into place. Some people like to go back through and snip off the ends of the connector, but I'm not going to worry about that unless we have an issue with the case. And then other people will go through at every step like this and clean with the alcohol to get the rosin flux off, but I'm not going to do that because it was pretty quick, pretty clean. One of the things we didn't mention before was the type of solder we're using. This is a 6337 solder. It's 63% tin, 37% lead. So it is a lead core solder, and that's why we have a fan to blow the smoke away. It's a 23 gauge solder, so it's very fine, and it really helps with these smaller pads. You could use the big huge solder here, but I mean, you can see the difference. Maybe you can see the difference between those two. It's 0.05 thick. This one's 0.05 thick, and then this one's 0.025 thick, so it's half the thickness. You use a little bit more as far as linear distance, but it melts quickly, and you can actually control very well, especially with ICs and smaller components, where the solder is going and how much you're putting in. And typically what I end up doing is, so I'll take a stretch about 2 feet long or whatever and break it off. That way I'm free to move around, and you might even coil it so you have a little control over how you're feeding it. The hotter the board gets, the quicker the solder will melt, the more it will flow, so you have to just make sure that you control the amount of solder you're putting on so you don't overload. Okay, so now I'm doing the socket for the IC. It basically is a plug that you plug your IC into. It's a lot of pins. The key to these other sockets was when you try to put it in there, the legs are a little spread, so you got to use your thumb to get them pushed in there. This one you just put in and it drops right in, but then it ends up, because there's so many pins, it ends up a little loose. So what I end up doing is, when I'm soldering the first pin, I'm holding the board down and solder it, and then when I take the soldering iron away, I hold it there until the solder cools, and then I'll do the last pin down here, soldered in, hold it down, so now it's holding that socket flush against the board until it cools, and then you go on to the rest of the pins. Cool. Alright, so we've got the socket installed. Now we're going to install the socket. Basically, again, I'm touching the mat. Should have a strap on, but I forgot to bring mine today. But anyway, you take the IC out and make sure that the notch on the IC matches the notch on the socket and on the board, and then get the legs lined up. Alright, so a little bit of a adjustment with the pins. Sometimes they're angled out a little too far, and you just have to go in there and just bend them all in towards the center of the chip, get them all lined up, make sure they're all in the right pockets and everything, and then just evenly push down on it. It snaps right into the board like that. it should be that easy every time, but you just have to look at the pins. You don't want to start pushing too hard with a pin that's not in there, because what will happen is it'll kink, and then trying to straighten that sucker back out, you're more than likely going to break it. So they're having me install resistors and capacitors and all kinds of diodes, you know, things in a different order than I'm used to. Usually I like to do all the resistors first because they're lowest to the board, and then all the diodes that are low to the board. But the decision you have to make is whether you trim the leads before you solder or after you solder. And I usually bend them over like this. But then when you start getting this rat's nest, it's about time to start soldering and then snip off the leads. We tried doing it, snipping off the leads first, but the problem there is if you snip it too close, you could potentially drop it out of the board and not get a good connection. So we're gonna go ahead and solder these in and then trim them off. So we've gone all the way to step 20 now, and I'm not liking the way it's organized. So we're going to change that. I know that they have a logical method of doing this and populating the board from a corner across, but I'm installing tall components and short components, and they're just going to get in the way. So we're going to change that. We're going to do all of the resistors first, like I normally would do. So we're going to just start skipping steps and going through and checking them off as we do them. But we're going to do all the resistors first, then we're going to do all the low diodes, then we're going to do all the caps, and go from there. So we're changing it up a little bit. It'll be easier for us and it'll go a lot quicker. So thank you. Alright, so after about what, 3-4 hours, whatever, we now have the board, the main board, all populated. And thinking about it, I guess the order that he was doing it was okay, but I still think doing all the resistors was the way to go, because we did all those resistors, and other than a few hiccups with the one resistor getting stuck to the bottom of a bowl and going missing on us for a little while there, it worked out pretty good. We got all those resistors in, and then we went back and did the higher, taller components. The thing that threw us off a little bit was I've never done these resistors to stand up on the board, so those kind of got in the way a little bit of a few things, but it would have happened anyway, trying to put the little capacitors in next to them. But here's the populated board. Something that I can't stress enough is to have a really good soldering iron, because when you're doing these components back here that have a lot of metal, they act as huge heat sinks. And you look at the back of the board and you look at how much solder ended up getting onto those, trying to get them soldered in there. It's not the prettiest, but hey, like I said, I'm a mechanical, not an electrical, so but they're all soldered in there. And these are also structural points too, because you're going to be connecting and disconnecting stuff there, so it's got to be really strong. Basically what they want us to do on this part of it is put the 14-pin connector through to put the LCD on, and get that insulator flush against both boards. So you have to press it together, but you don't want to press on the LCD because you could damage it. You want to press on the PC board itself, but it rocks, so you have to kind of get a central point to push. And what I've done is I've soldered one pin and then use that to hold the board in place. And you can then go to the other end and solder another pin, and that'll lock it in place completely. So check again, it's flush against both boards. If it wasn't, then what I'd do is I'd pinch the boards together and heat up the solder, let go, hold it for a few seconds, let it set, and then you're done. Then you can go and solder the rest of it.
Comment on the orientation that we ran into, that regarding instructions that your partner did not get to you soon enough.
So Doug didn't read the whole paragraph, but he told me to put J5 and J2 in, and so here I am putting J2 and J5 in from this side of the board. Well, those two need to go on the back side of the board, and I'd already soldered in both of them, not completely, but 2 pins on one and 5 pins on the other. So we had to get the desoldering gun out and try to pull out the solder, and then we had pins that came out. We had to reassemble one of the junctions, or one of the connectors. So those are very critical to go on the back side of the board, because that's what's going to interface with the main board. Once you set it in there, then those pins will be on the main board. So read the full paragraph before you start soldering is the key that I'm trying to get across here. Thank you. Okay, so we got the LCD board put in. Again, critical to get the insulator flush against both. We put the adjustment for the LCD display on the front, on the back of the board, so that you can adjust your resolution, your brightness of the LCD. Note that you don't put in the diode, the green diode, this little dude yet. You'll do that when you're putting it into the case, so you have to align that up to get it into the hole and get the leads the right length. Something that's not covered real clearly, but I think it's, you know, a little common sense, like the guy says in there, sometimes works. These little connectors here are what join the two boards together. You've got the two headers here, and on the board you've got traces on the back and on the front. And it's not real clear how you're supposed to join that together, if you're supposed to set it how, I mean, what we've determined is that the board goes between the pins on the header. So it would go so that there's pins on top of the board and pins on the bottom of the board. And then what they tell you to do is to solder a corner, this corner, and probably come to the other side and solder a corner just to get it positioned, and then you can do fit checks in your case to make sure that it's going to fit right before you solder them all in. But that's how it's going to go in the case, is let the board up like this, and then they said once you get it to this stage and get it soldered in, got to be careful, don't want to bend the board at all, because you'll break some fit connections, but we're getting close. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to install the board into the case, and you've got these little brass pieces here. I don't know if you can see that real well or not. I can set it right there and you can just look at it on the board, on the panel. See that?
Yep.
So there's a double-sided tape on the bottom of that, and what we're going to do is we're going to tape all 6 of these on this little ledge that's inside the case right here. So you come a 1/2 inch in from the end and put one of those on, and then a 1/2 inch in from the other end, put one of them on, and then midway between, like center of the case, put another one on, all facing the same direction. And you do that on both sides, and what that does is it grounds the board out, the ground plane, I assume, to the case with those little brass connectors. The double-sided tape is only on one side. The little foot on the other end doesn't have that tape on it. And you put them all in the same direction. What we've done is I've taken some alcohol and I've cleaned the surface to get all the oil or residue off of the little ledge, so that the double-sided tape has a chance of sticking. It's pressure sensitive, so you can put it down, position it, and then use a flat screwdriver or something else like the back of this, I guess I could use, to press down on it, and that's what's going to stick it. Once you do that, it theoretically shouldn't come back out. If you need to reposition it, you got to get more double-sided tape, I think. But as you're positioning it, you can set it there, and it won't stick really well, so you might be able to move it a little bit, but you better be sure where you're putting it before you put it down there. So probably what I'm going to do is take my little marker and mark exactly where the ends of them are going to go, and then I'll just stick them right in there.
All right, you're on anyway. You can kind of finish that.
All right, so we've got it all together here. I'm buttoning it up, putting the last screws in. We deviated a little bit from the plan, I think. We soldered the daughter board to the main board a little early. We were supposed to do a fit up, and we kind of already sort of did a fit up, But that's a critical thing, is to make sure all the buttons fit in the front, and they do, and make sure that the power button cycles on and off. And then the LED fits in there properly. So you got 2 screws in the front, put the bezel on. This is a sticker that we had to assemble right here. On the back, 2 more screws. And then there is a lock washer, a star washer and a nut here that you put on. And then you basically power the unit up, set your frequencies and stuff. That's all in the manual. We did find one short, so oops.
Like they say, you should check your work.
Yeah, check your work. And we were checking along the way, but towards the end you tend to rush a little bit, and that's lesson learned, you know, and we know that, and that's why I went back and looked and found a short. And what it was doing was, when we were trying to set the volume, or the frequency, when we were setting the frequency, it actually tells you a voltage depending on what frequency you select. And it was pegging out to 10 volts, which means that it's above the range, and it wasn't locking. And so that told us we had something wrong, so you start troubleshooting. Once we got rid of the short, we got music. So I'm happy, it's done. And now we just have to pick a right frequency that's not going to interfere with anybody in the neighborhood, pick the power that we need to cover the area that Doug wants, and then done deal. So it's actually a nice little unit, and surprisingly the sound out of it is pretty darn good. We were out in the garage with it down here, set at very low power, and we're getting thumping bass in his car, listening to some music, and then even the Bose over here was thumping. So it's pretty surprisingly clear and good sounding. So instructions can use a little bit of work, but if you have patience and read through it a few times, all can be worked out. And yes, we used all the parts. We don't have any leftovers. We don't have any extras.
We did have to replace one.
We did have to replace one because we were missing it.
Missing it, yeah.
We're missing it from the kit. So I'm sure that we'll get some feedback to the vendor on that. But luckily for us, Radio Shack actually had the right capacitor that we needed. It was one of those little flat ceramic capacitors. It was missing, and so there is a
PF100.
Yeah, the 100 micro Pico Fair had one, but it actually works. So, all right.
Yep.
So you're hearing the static over there. I'm about to turn it on, and you can hear the music after I turn it on. Theoretically.
I was the only boy who could ever reach me. Was the son of a preacher man. The only boy who could ever teach me. Was the son of a preacher man. Yes, he was. He was. Oh, yes, he was. Yeah.
And
I'm being good isn't always easy. No matter how hard I try. When he started sweet talking to me, he come and tell me everything.
Does he play any music, or is it just a cappella the whole way through? I'm waiting for the bass, man. Where is it? It works. Lock button, lock lights on. So good deal. It seems to work. Nothing, no magic smoke got out. Nothing popped. No caps in backwards. Those usually go off like a little firecracker. And there you go. It's the Ramsey FM30B is what we've done here. So nice little unit. Display is a little bit more difficult to read than I'd like, but other than that, it's working pretty good. Now it's just a matter of getting it installed and putting it through its paces.